The prairie stretched wide and endless, the kind of horizon that swallowed up the sun and left a person feeling small beneath the sweep of the sky. Clara James leaned against the porch railing of her weathered cabin, her hands wrapped tight around a chipped mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her eyes, though, weren't on the land. They were fixed on the bathtub sitting in the corner of the porch, the one she'd had hauled up from the creek last summer. To anyone else, it looked like nothing, an old relic, worn wood and iron patches holding it together, more trouble than it was worth. Neighbors had laughed when they saw her keep it, told her it was foolish for a widow to hang on to something that didn't serve a purpose. But Clara had never been able to let it go. Somehow, that battered old tub had become more than just a thing. It was a reminder, though, of what she couldn't quite say. Her husband had been gone nearly 2 years, a fever sweeping through town and leaving her with 2 young boys in a silence too thick to breathe. Since then, every corner of her life had felt unfinished. She woke in the mornings with chores stretching further than daylight, fixed meals she barely tasted, and put her boys to bed with stories told in a voice that always cracked in the middle. The bathtub was no different, unfinished, patched, carrying scars of use and age. But when she looked at it, Clara felt a strange companionship, as if the tub knew what it was to stand and wait, to be seen as whole when inside it wasn't. That morning the air smelled like dust and old pine. A hawk drifted lazy circles above the pasture where her boys tried to chase chickens back into the pen, their laughter too rare these days. Clara turned her head at the sound of hooves. A rider was coming slow up the trail, hat pulled low, shoulders squared like a man who carried more weight than his horse ever could. She knew him by sight, Luke Thatcher. Folks in town called him a quiet one, said he'd lost too much too young, and carried that loss in his silence. She had never spoken to him, only watched him pass by at the mercantile or water his horse at the trough. He stopped at the gate, swung down, and tied his reins with the kind of care that made her take notice. When he walked toward her porch, he didn't swagger like other men. He moved steady, deliberate, like someone who thought about every step before he made it. "Ma'am," he said with a nod, his voice low and steady, as if the prairie itself had spoken through him. "Fence along your east side is leaning. Posts won't hold through another storm." Clara straightened, wary. She had learned to guard herself. Men offered help with one hand and took something with the other. "I know," she said carefully. "I'll see to it when I can." "I can see to it now," Luke replied, eyes not quite meeting hers but fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if it was easier for him to speak without looking directly at her. "Got tools in my saddlebag. Won't take long." She hesitated. Pride told her to refuse, but the thought of those posts snapping and her boys' only corral falling apart made her nod. "If you're sure." Luke wasted no time. He worked with quiet precision, pulling rotted posts and setting them deep in the earth, his muscles moving under a shirt gone soft with wear. Clara watched from the porch, arms crossed, trying not to notice the way her boys gravitated toward him, carrying him nails, chattering about chickens and chores, their small faces lit with something she hadn't seen in months, trust. By late afternoon, the fence stood straighter than it had in years. Luke gathered his tools, dusting off his hands, and finally turned toward the porch. That was when his gaze shifted, not to her, but to the bathtub. "You know, what's missing?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone speaking to himself as much as to her. Clara blinked, taken off guard. "Missing? It's just an old tub, Mr. Thatcher." He stepped closer, slow, until he stood by the battered thing as though it deserved his respect. His hand, broad and scarred, ran across the rim like he was tracing a memory. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "Not just a tub. Someone built this with care. You can see it in the way the wood was shaped, the way it's patched. But there's a piece gone." His finger tapped a corner where a wooden slat had been pried off, the edge raw and unfinished. That piece mattered. Without it, it'll always feel incomplete. Clara stared at him, her throat tightening. The wind lifted strands of her hair across her cheek, and she didn't move to brush them away. It wasn't just the bathtub he was talking about. She knew it. He had seen something she hadn't wanted anyone to notice, that she, too, had pieces gone, carved out by loss, leaving edges too raw to heal. Her voice came thin, almost a whisper. "I hadn't noticed." Luke's eyes flicked up then, just once, long enough for her to see the storm behind them. Most people don't. Most people don't look close enough. He didn't linger. He tipped his hat, murmured thanks for water when she offered it, and left with the same steady steps he'd come with. But his words stayed, echoing in the silence long after the sound of his horse faded down the trail. That night Clara sat by the fire, her boys already asleep in the loft above, their soft breathing the only sound in the room. She turned her gaze, as she always did, to the porch where the tub stood silhouetted in moonlight. She thought of Luke's hand tracing its rim, his voice naming what was missing, and the way it had pierced her like an arrow she hadn't expected. For so long, she had believed herself whole enough. Not happy, not complete, but functional, like the old tub, patched and standing. Now, for the first time, she saw the truth. She had been ignoring the raw edges, pretending they weren't there. And somehow, in a single glance, the quiet cowboy had seen them. Clara pressed her face into her hands, tears wetting her palms. She dreamed that night of her husband's laughter, of children splashing water in a tub by the creek, of the sound of joy that had once filled her life. When she woke, dawn crept pale across the horizon, and the house felt heavier than ever. She rose, went to the porch, and touched the rough wood where the missing slat had been. Her fingers lingered there, and her heart whispered words she had tried not to speak aloud. Maybe the cowboy hadn't come just to fix her fence. Maybe God had sent him to show her what still needed mending inside herself. Days slipped into weeks, and though Clara told herself she had no reason to expect it, Luke Thatcher returned. At first, it was for small things, a tool borrowed, a stray calf nudged back across the line, a roof shingle hammered in place before the wind could carry it off. He never came empty-handed, though not once did he arrive with flowers or sweet words like other men might have tried. Instead, he brought presence, steady and unshakable, a kind of help that never asked for thanks. Clara told herself she didn't want company, that her life was too full with work and her boys to think of anything beyond survival. But the way her sons looked up at him, the way they trailed after his boots with questions about horses and ranching, told her she couldn't pretend he hadn't left a mark. Each time Luke was near, Clara noticed how his eyes always found the bathtub. He never spoke of it right away, but she caught him glancing at it, his gaze lingering as though it held more weight than a simple piece of wood and iron had any right to. Finally, one afternoon when he had been mending the loft ladder, Clara broke the silence. "Why do you care so much about a broken tub?" Her voice carried across the porch, edged with curiosity and a hint of defensiveness. She'd been thinking about his words for days, and the question had been pressing against her chest until it forced itself out. Luke didn't answer right away. He finished adjusting the last rung of the ladder, set his hammer down, and wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. When he finally turned toward her, his eyes weren't guarded, not like they usually were. They were distant, softened by memory. "When I was a boy," he said slowly, as though pulling the words up from someplace buried deep, "my ma had one just like it. She used to sing while she scrubbed. Said a bath could wash away more than dirt. Said it could wash away sorrow, too." His lips pressed into a faint line, and his voice dropped lower. "After she passed, Pa left the tub behind when we moved. Said it was nothing but heavy wood and iron. But it wasn't the tub I missed, it was what it held." The sound of her voice. The feeling that things could be clean again. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected him to share something so personal, not from a man known for his silence. For a moment, the prairie around them seemed to hush, as if the land itself wanted to listen. She looked at the tub then, and for the first time she didn't see a useless relic cluttering her porch. She saw what Luke saw. Memory, love, the kind of invisible weight that lingered in ordinary objects. She didn't say anything. Instead, she nodded, her hand brushing the rim of her apron as though steadying herself. Luke gave a single tilt of his hat, then turned back to his work, leaving her to her thoughts. That night, Clara found herself sitting on the porch after her boys had gone to bed, her fingers running along the rough place where the missing slat had once been. She thought of her husband, of the evenings they used to spend laughing under the stars, of the way her boys had splashed in creek water while she scolded and smiled in the same breath. It wasn't just the bathtub that was missing something. She was missing parts of herself, parts carved out by grief and silence, pieces she had tried to hide beneath the weight of chores and survival. Luke didn't press her. He never asked for more than she was willing to give, never hinted at pity or expectation. He came back, steady as the rising sun, each visit carrying the quiet message that he was there, whether she asked for him or not. The boys grew used to him, their laughter chasing after his footsteps, and Clara found herself softening against her own will. His silence wasn't empty, it was full. Full of patience, of stories untold, of a steadiness she hadn't realized she needed until it was beside her. One evening, after they had spent the day clearing brush by the creek, Clara caught him standing by the bathtub again. The sunset threw long shadows across the porch, the sky painted in streaks of orange and violet. Luke's hand rested on the rim, his thumb brushing over the missing place, and for a long while he said nothing. Then, in a voice low enough that it almost blended with the evening wind, he spoke. "You don't have to carry the missing pieces alone. Sometimes someone else can help you find them." The words pierced her in a way nothing else had since her husband's death. She stood frozen, unable to look at him, tears stinging her eyes before she could will them away. For months, she had been strong for her children, silent for herself, pretending the world couldn't see the holes left behind. And here was a man who hadn't asked her to speak, hadn't asked her to be whole, only reminded her that broken didn't mean abandoned. Her tears spilled, and she didn't fight them. She sank onto the porch steps, shoulders trembling, her face hidden in her hands. For the first time in years, she let herself cry in front of someone. Luke didn't move closer. He didn't touch her. He stood steady, silent, like the post he had driven deep into her soil, firm enough for her to lean against without fear it might break. When her sobs quieted, the night had fallen deep. The prairie wind brushed cool against her damp cheeks, and the stars blinked into place one by one. Luke was still there, his presence a quiet vow. She didn't thank him, not with words. Instead, she lifted her head, met his eyes, and knew he understood. The days after that were different. The chores were still hard, the nights still long, but Clara no longer felt like she was walking through them alone. Luke became a fixture, not because he demanded it, but because he fit, like a missing slat restored, like something that had been waiting for its place all along. When he worked beside her boys, their laughter came easier. When his hand brushed hers by accident, she didn't pull away. Weeks turned to months, and Clara began to notice the change in herself. She laughed more often, not the forced sound she used to give her children but laughter that rose from somewhere deeper. She sang once, softly while sweeping the floor, and caught Luke's eyes flick toward her, surprised, almost startled, as though her voice had woken something in him too. She thought again of what he had said, that night by the bathtub, that missing pieces didn't have to be carried alone. She had spent so long convincing herself she was like that tub, patched and standing, but never whole. Yet each day with Luke showed her something new. Missing didn't mean broken beyond repair. Sometimes it meant there was space for something stronger, something truer to be built. One dusky evening, as the prairie sky burned low with firelight clouds, Luke's hand brushed hers again, this time on purpose. His eyes searched hers, asking a question he didn't put into words. Clara's heart, once raw with emptiness, no longer trembled with fear of what was gone. Instead, it swelled with the quiet truth she had learned. She thought it was just a bathtub. But the lonely cowboy had shown her it was something more. It was a mirror of her own heart, unfinished, waiting, and ready to be filled again.